As the smoke cleared from a hibernation pod, the man inside was injected with a revival serum. The man took a deep breath and slowly opened his eyes. In front of him appeared a holographic 3D screen, with a virtual woman on the screen. The newly awakened man, still confused about the situation, grabbed the sides of the pod door in shock. The virtual receptionist introduced the man to his current situation. It turns out that the man's name is Jim, and he is a passenger on the spaceship. As a new immigrant, he is traveling aboard this ship to a distant planet. Due to the long journey, the entire trip would take 120 years, and all passengers would be awakened 4 months before reaching the destination. They would get to know each other and prepare for landing. Each passenger had an identification wristband, which they could use to unlock various tools and amenities on the ship. The system guided Jim to his personal cabin. Since Jim was just an ordinary engineer and didn't have much money, the room allocated to him was small and cramped. After taking a shower, Jim felt more awake, changed into his clothes, and excitedly prepared to meet new friends. However, when he arrived at the meeting room, there wasn't a single person there. The virtual hostess at the reception introduced him to the beautiful scenery of the new home. But what made him feel strange was that the hostess seemed to be addressing a large group, using the term "you all." While there was only Jim in the room, Jim started to feel that something was wrong. He searched the entire ship but couldn't find a single person. Jim arrived at the central hull of the ship and asked the system where he could find a living person. The system suggested he try to find the captain, so Jim went to the captain's door. However, due to his restricted access level, he couldn't open the door. He could only look through the glass, but even the command station was completely empty. Jim then went to the observatory, and through a holographic animation, he finally realized a terrifying truth. The spaceship had been traveling for 30 years, and it would take another 90 years to reach the new planet. Jim's hibernation pod had somehow opened prematurely, and now he understood the seriousness of the problem. He would live and die alone on this spaceship. Depressed and frustrated, Jim walked through the central hall when he suddenly noticed someone in the bar, a bartender cleaning glasses. Excited, he rushed over to the bartender, who greeted him, but the next moment, Jim's excitement faded. It turned out that the bartender was an android, a simulation robot named Arthur. Arthur became Jim's only conversational companion on the ship. The next day, Jim woke up and went to the cafeteria, hoping to treat himself to some good food to cheer up. But since he had been poor on Earth, he wasn't allowed to order the more luxurious meals or drinks in the cafeteria. After frantically pressing the buttons, he could only get the cheapest, large instant coffee. With plenty of time on his hands, Jim didn't want to sit idly by. As an engineer, he decided to try and save himself. He found the tools room and pulled out a large amount of repair equipment. Using the manuals, he started working on fixing the hibernation pod. After a lot of effort, Jim rebooted the pod, quickly lying inside, hoping to go back into hibernation, but to his dismay, there was no response when he lay down, and he almost suffocated inside. Jim returned to the bridge, thinking that if he could get inside, there might be machines to restart the hibernation process. But no matter what methods he used, he couldn't open the door to the command room. Jim felt like he was doomed. However, one remark from the robot bartender Arthur enlightened him. Arthur told him to enjoy life. Jim finally came to terms with it and decided not to be restricted by the ship's rules. He pried open the door to the presidential suite and moved into the luxurious, golden room. He started indulging in all the entertainment facilities and treating himself to gourmet meals from the upscale restaurant. But in the cafeteria, they still only served him large cups of coffee. Living in this way, he spent an entire year in a daze and gradually turned into an unkempt wild man. Things he once found fun no longer entertained him after playing with them for a year by himself. He began to drink excessively, wandering around the spaceship every day, lost in a stupor. One day, he discovered a hidden door that led to the spacesuit storage room. In his extreme loneliness, he leaned against one of the spacesuits, imagining it was a living person. He longed for someone to hold him. Jim put on a spacesuit, opened the ship's hatch, and walked outside into space. He floated in the vast cosmos, feeling his smallness and loneliness in the universe. Tears silently streamed down his face. At that moment, he couldn't feel any warmth, only endless cold. Jim returned to the ship, took off the spacesuit, and was about to leave. But then he hesitated and went back to the airlock. He wanted to open the hatch and end his life of boredom, but in the end, he couldn't do it and ran back into the ship in a panic. As he passed the hibernation hall, he didn't notice the bottle he had carelessly thrown on the floor and tripped over, landing hard. As Jim struggled to get up, his gaze was caught by a woman in one of the hibernation pods nearby. She was a blonde woman named Aurora, a writer, Her beautiful face deeply attracted Jim, who had been lonely for so long. Jim accessed Aurora's profile, and as he watched the videos of her speaking confidently, he found himself liking her more and more. It got to the point where Jim's biggest entertainment each day was watching Aurora's videos and smiling foolishly, until one day, while watching the video, he accidentally caught sight of the hibernation pod repair manual next to him, and evil thoughts suddenly crept into his mind. He wanted to wake up Aurora, but he knew it was wrong. He tried to convince himself to resist the idea, but once the thought had taken root, it spread like a virus, continuously gnawing at Jim's mind, causing him to struggle and torment himself. Finally, he made up his mind. After trimming his hair, he grabbed his toolbox and approached Aurora's hibernation pod. Jim opened the chip box of the hibernation pod and inserted his newly decoded chip. Finally, he carefully connected the power supply, and the hibernation pod slowly opened. At that moment, Jim was afraid of being discovered, so he quickly packed up his toolbox. Before Aurora could open her eyes, he ran back to his room. At that moment, he felt like he had opened Pandora's box. Feeling both guilty and excited, Jim pretended to hear a noise and went to the central hall, where he accidentally ran into Aurora, who had just woken up and was looking around for others. Aurora, at this moment, was exactly like Jim a year ago, completely bewildered by everything around her. But when Jim told her that the two of them were the only passengers who had woken up due to an accident, and that they would have to live alone on the spaceship for the next 89 years, possibly dying before ever seeing their new home, Aurora couldn't accept this reality. Panicked, she turned and ran. She still hoped that returning to her hibernation pod and restarting it could put her back to sleep. She frantically searched for her hibernation pod, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find it. Jim grabbed the frantic Aurora and told her that he had already tried that method. It didn't work. As Aurora slowly calmed down, she felt utterly exhausted and just wanted to go back and get a good night's sleep. Jim went to the bar and asked Arthur, the only one who knew about this, to keep the secret. Arthur agreed. The next day, Jim took Aurora to the cafeteria for breakfast. Aurora, unlike Jim the poor man, could order the luxury breakfast. The difference in what they ate was stark. Generous Aurora treated Jim to a lavish breakfast as well. Feeling hopeful, Aurora, like Jim had once done, didn't want to just sit around and wait for the inevitable. She searched through various materials and clues, just like Jim, trying to unlock the command room's door and gain access, but it was all in vain. Jim had already tried all of this a year ago. Accepting reality, Aurora found Jim and asked how he had spent the past year. Jim then took her to the dance machine, but this time, he finally got to try the two-player cooperative mode. Next came basketball, the movie theater, and Arthur's bar. These activities finally brought a smile to the previously downcast Aurora, and life, which once seemed hopeless, now had a bit of brightness. In the days that followed, Jim and Aurora quickly became close. One night, Jim stayed up all night without sleeping, creating a model of the famous buildings from Aurora's hometown of New York, which touched her deeply. Jim modified a cleaning robot by attaching a camera to the top, and then he remotely controlled it to approach Aurora. The robot extended a small note from its belly. Aurora opened it to find that Jim was asking her to dinner that evening. Aurora asked the little robot whether she should agree. The robot nodded, so Aurora wrote her reply on the note. Jim anxiously opened the note and smiled with joy. Aurora had agreed to go on a date with him. That evening, the two dressed in their finest clothes and had dinner together at the restaurant. They talked about their past experiences, getting to know each other better. After dinner, Jim took Aurora to his secret base, the place where the spacesuits were stored. There happened to be a female spacesuit there as well, but since Aurora was wearing a dress, it wasn't very convenient. She asked Jim to turn around. Aurora undressed right behind Jim, purposely tossing her dress onto the floor at his feet. The two astronauts walked outside the spaceship, and Jim unlocked Aurora's magnetic tether. Holding her hand, they leapt into space together. It seemed that even in the loneliest place in the world, being with someone you like could turn it into the most romantic date spot. Jim and Aurora were now together, living on the cold, empty spaceship. They were like refugees stranded on a deserted island, relying on each other. They became a loving couple. They were very happy every day. But good times never last. Fate always likes to play tricks on people. On Aurora's birthday, the two were celebrating and drinking at Arthur's bar. Aurora was happily saying that she and Jim were so close that there were no secrets between them. When Arthur, the robot, heard this, it seemed like it triggered a command. Jim went to the bathroom, pulling a ring from his pocket. It turned out he was planning to propose to Aurora today. Meanwhile, on the other side, Arthur revealed the secret he had been keeping for Jim to Aurora. Aurora, upon learning the truth, couldn't accept the reality. When Jim returned and saw the look on Aurora's face, he knew the secret was out. Aurora, in disbelief, asked Jim to confirm the truth. When she heard Jim's answer, she felt like she was about to faint. She couldn't believe that the man she had just fallen in love with was the one who had caused her to wake up early. Everything before had been a lie. Late at night, Aurora came to Jim's bed and began hitting him violently. She wanted nothing more than to kill this man, but when she raised the iron bar, she couldn't bring herself to strike him. From then on, Aurora kept a cold distance from Jim. Even when they went to the bar, they went at different times. During this period, the spaceship began to experience more frequent problems. Jim was once stuck in the elevator midair, and Aurora, while eating breakfast, saw cereal spraying out like it was free. At this moment, a man's voice suddenly appeared on the spaceship's intercom, instructing all awakened passengers to come to the central hall. Hearing this, the two of them hurried to the hall, where they saw a man in a uniform standing in the center. It turned out that he was the third person to be unexpectedly awakened. He was the ship's chief deck officer. Like Jim, he had been awoken due to a system failure. The chief led them into the command room. This was the place that Jim and Aurora had dreamed of entering but had been unable to access. The chief checked the system to diagnose the malfunction, but the data was missing. With no other options, he decided to inspect the issue manually. After inspecting the 3 malfunctioning hibernation pods, the chief officer had already discovered some issues. He found out that both he and Jim had been awakened due to system malfunctions, but Aurora had been awakened by Jim. Oddly enough, the chief officer did not blame Jim for this. Feeling uneasy, Aurora sought out the chief officer and asked him what should be done about the situation. The chief officer, speaking earnestly, told Aurora that Jim was like a drowning man, and a drowning person's instinct is to pull someone down with them. As the chief officer returned to his room to rest, he suddenly began coughing violently. He looked at his hand, which was covering his mouth, and saw that he had coughed up blood. That night, Aurora, troubled and unable to sleep, went to the swimming pool to calm herself down by swimming. However, just then, another problem occurred on the ship. There was a sudden power outage, which caused the ship's gravity to fail, and the entire pool of water floated into the air. Aurora was trapped in a suspended water bubble, completely unable to break free. With no gravity and no way to slide out, she was on the verge of drowning. Suddenly, the ship's power was restored. The gravity system reactivated, and Aurora narrowly escaped death. The 3 returned to the command room, and since the system had rebooted, the database was back online. The chief officer reviewed the ship's fault logs to find out what had caused the malfunction. It turned out that while the ship was traveling, it had been protected by a strong shield to fend off small meteors. But a year ago, a massive meteor suddenly appeared in front of the ship and smashed through the shield. The fragments hit the ship, and that impact had caused the malfunction in Jim's and the chief officer's hibernation pods. The chief officer took the 2 to the engineering section at the bottom of the ship, where it was filled with various functional pods. Due to the system malfunction, they now had to manually search for and repair the damaged area. But just then, the chief officer suddenly collapsed without warning. Jim and Aurora rushed to take him to the medical pod. A system scan revealed that he had 612 damaged bodily functions. It turned out that when the chief officer's hibernation pod malfunctioned, he hadn't woken up right away, causing prolonged oxygen deprivation, which severely damaged his body. The chief officer was dying. In his final moments, he handed his captain's wristband to Jim, granting him access to all areas of the ship. He entrusted Jim with the responsibility of repairing the ship, as the lives of 5,000 people depended on it. After saying this, he died in Jim's arms. Jim and Aurora had no time to grieve before the ship was rocked by a violent tremor. It was clear that the ship's problems were getting worse and more urgent. The 2 ran toward the engineering section, but suddenly the gravity failed again, and they were both sent flying into the air. Then, just as quickly, the gravity was restored, and they both crashed heavily to the ground. At that moment, the ship was like an out-of-control beast, and they didn't have much time left. As they passed by the bar, they saw that Arthur, the bartender, was also malfunctioning. His head was scraping along the bar, repeatedly smashing glasses. Jim quickly jumped over the bar and pulled out Arthur's malfunctioning chip, finally stopping him. The 2 made their way to the massive engineering section, where they had to find the place that had been hit by the meteor. After some searching, and with Aurora's help, Jim quickly located the compartment where the problem lay. As soon as he opened the door, a powerful gust of air sucked Aurora inside. It turned out there was a small hole where the meteor had penetrated, and the air was rushing out through it. The pressure hatch was about to automatically close, so Jim rushed over and used his body to block the door. but the oxygen levels in the compartment were dropping rapidly, and if this continued, they would both suffocate. Jim desperately kicked at the display panel by his feet. Aurora took the opportunity to grab the display screen and fly to the side of the compartment, using it to cover the hole. Taking advantage of the reduced suction, Jim quickly grabbed a sealing compound and patched up the hole. They barely had time to catch their breath before realizing that there wasn't just one hole the meteors had pierced through the entire compartment. They opened another door and finally found the root cause of the ship's malfunctions. The meteor had damaged the ship's reactor, causing a series of cascading failures. Inside the reactor, flames were blazing, and if it wasn't repaired soon, it could explode at any moment. Jim quickly grabbed a new reactor chip and replaced the damaged one. The ship's system was fully restored, but now they had to vent the massive amount of heat that had built up in the reactor to make it safe. However, a new problem arose. The system showed that the venting had failed, and the vent had to be manually opened. The system indicated that the exhaust vent was jammed. Someone needed to open that vent to allow the reactor to cool down. Jim suggested the only solution he would have to go outside the ship and manually open the vent from the outside. To avoid getting burned, Jim found an iron door to use as a heat shield. Before heading out, Jim handed the captain's wristband, which the chief officer had given him, to Aurora. Aurora understood that this meant Jim might not come back. At this moment, Aurora's heart was no longer filled with anger and hatred. She personally placed the helmet on Jim's head, and just as Jim was about to exit the ship, she suddenly called out to him.
I can't live on this ship without you.
Aurora ran back to the reactor room, which by now had become an oven of scorching hot air. A steel nail on the wall snapped and shot into Aurora's shoulder. She gritted her teeth, enduring the pain as she pulled the nail out. Meanwhile, Jim floated to the vent and entered the duct. Reaching the vent door, Jim tried to open the iron door, but as soon as he let go, the door automatically closed again. In this case, the hot air still couldn't be vented. Jim decided to stay by the door and manually hold it open. Aurora realized that if Jim did this, he would be burned alive. She pleaded with Jim to leave, but by this time, Jim had made up his mind. To save the lives of the other passengers, he decided to sacrifice himself. At this moment, Jim was no longer the selfish, lonely man he had been a year ago. He had transformed into a hero. Aurora, filled with pain, pulled down the brake. Flames erupted from the vent, and Jim used only a small piece of metal to shield himself from the heat. But eventually, the blast wave pushed him out into space. At this point, the reactor finally cooled down and returned to normal operation. Jim was thrown far away by the blast, and he was drifting toward the ship's exhaust nozzle at the rear. To avoid being incinerated, Jim threw the iron panel he was holding, using the force to push himself away from the exhaust nozzle. But another crisis arose. His spacesuit had been damaged by the heat, and multiple tears appeared, causing the temperature inside to plummet, and his oxygen levels were rapidly depleting. His tether had also snapped, and he was drifting further and further away. Aurora, hearing the news, quickly put on her spacesuit and went outside the ship. She located Jim and used her magnetic boots to launch herself toward him. Just as she was about to reach Jim, her tether reached its maximum length, yanking her backward. Aurora watched helplessly as Jim drifted further away, screaming in agony. At that moment, Jim's tether floated toward her. Aurora seized the opportunity and grabbed the rope, pulling Jim back with all her strength. Aurora dragged the unconscious Jim into the medical pod, but after scanning his body, the system declared Jim dead. Aurora couldn't believe this terrible news. Suddenly, she remembered the captain's wristband. She used the wristband to override the medical pod controls, initiating 10 high-level surgeries on Jim. Countless robotic arms and lasers worked on Jim's body. After a flurry of operations, Jim woke up. He had been revived. Aurora cried and kissed her lover, crying and laughing with joy. Everything returned to normal, and the ship continued on its predetermined course. After being saved by the medical pod, Jim realized how powerful it was and studied it carefully. Eventually, he discovered an important function. He found out that the medical pod had a feature similar to hibernation. It could allow someone to lie inside and return to sleep. But there was only one medical pod, so Jim decided to let Aurora use it. This way, Aurora could return to hibernation and wake up with the other passengers, meet new friends, and start a new life on the new planet. This would also be a way for Jim to atone for the wrong he had done to Aurora. However, it would mean that Jim would once again be left alone. Despite this, he left the decision to Aurora. In Arthur's bar, Jim looked at the ring he had never given to her. Life is full of regrets, and what's one more? At that moment, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. Jim smiled. Aurora, still as radiant as ever, had returned. This time, Jim put the ring on her finger himself. On this long journey through the vast universe, the two would spend the rest of their lives together. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.